Hi, Laura, if you turn on your mic as well.
Hello.
Welcome.
Thank you.
And I just want to say a big thank you to Laura for agreeing to offer this webinar to what looks like the entire world at the moment, Laura. So we've got teachers from everywhere. Laura is a language and pedagogy consultant. She's trained teachers all over the world on using, learning, and teaching English in international contexts. She specializes in pronunciation and listening. Pronunciation was always my favorite part of teaching, so I'm excited about this webinar. I can also vouch for the fact that quizzes, well, as we were once on the victorious quiz team at an event, I didn't contribute anything. And she's here today to talk about teaching English pronunciation for the real world. Welcome and thank you very much for offering this webinar today.
So shall we begin? Excellent. Thanks, Mike, for that introduction. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you from all over the world. It's very exciting always to see such a wide and international audience. We're going to cover several things in this webinar. So we'll start with the most important question, which is why? Why teach pronunciation at all? Why is this webinar important? And then we'll look at who uses English nowadays and what that means for our priorities when we're teaching pronunciation. And we'll finish, of course, with some practical activities, ideas. And before you leave, I'll give you some suggestions for further reading and further reflection. And if we have time, some questions and answers. As Mike mentioned, there will be a recording of this webinar later, and the slides will also be available. So feel free to take notes and ask questions, but we're going to cover a lot of information. The slides often include references or links. So if you just want to sit back and enjoy and participate, then you can find all of those references and links in the slides later. So don't worry about trying to keep up with everything. Now, before we begin, so I can get to know you a little bit, we're going to do a quick poll. This is the question, is how do you feel about teaching pronunciation? And I'm going to give 3 options to choose from. In a moment, your screen will change and you'll see that you have 3 buttons that you can click. So I want you to vote, and I'll give you 1 minute to choose from these 3 options. You should be able to see it now. So please tell me honestly, how do you feel about teaching pronunciation? Not confident, fairly confident, or very confident? So you should be able to click your choice on your screen, and this is showing me results now, which I'll share with you in a moment. Okay, about 2/3 of you have voted. Please keep going. Click your answer. Okay, so most of you say fairly confident, but you'd like to learn some more, which is great since you're here today, and I hope that we can all build on the knowledge that we already have and share some of our best practice. Okay, so I don't know if you can see what I see on my screen, but this is showing me that of all the people who have voted, most of you are somewhere in the middle, fairly confident. You feel okay, but you'd like to learn a little bit more. So let's come back to the main webinar. Thank you very much for voting. Now I feel like I know a little bit more about you. There you go. Now I think you can see the results. Okay. So, to begin with then, now we know a little bit about each other. Why are we here? Why teach pronunciation at all? Well, there are several very good reasons. So, first of all, we know from research that by working on pronunciation in our lessons, we can improve students speaking in more spontaneous contexts. So it's worth doing. It's a valuable part of our ELT courses. We also know that it particularly impacts spoken intelligibility, so our ability to make ourselves understood when speaking, and also our listening skills. So working on pronunciation in class also helps us understand other people's pronunciation. What I find really interesting, though, is that there's actually a lot of research that shows that our phonological awareness, our awareness of sound, impacts all four skills and grammar and vocabulary. So it's not only about improving speaking and listening. Actually, if we work on pronunciation in class, our students tend to be faster readers, for example, because they're better able to process the relationship between spelling and sound. They're more likely to use words which they know and not avoid them because they don't know how to pronounce them. So again, it's worth including pronunciation not only for speaking and listening, but for all aspects of proficiency. And finally, and perhaps the most important reason to include pronunciation in an ELT course, at least from today's perspective of the webinar, is that teachers across the world tend to lack confidence and training. So by including more pronunciation in our courses, we not only benefit our students, but we ourselves gain experience and more confidence in doing so. So in summary, we should include pronunciation in our courses because it's necessary and it works. But we do also know that teachers don't always feel comfortable with it. And that's why I'm really glad that you are all here today. So before we can say more about techniques and activities for teaching pronunciation, we need to think for a moment about what our goals actually are and whether they're achievable. So my feeling is that a lot of teachers avoid or even fear teaching pronunciation because they set goals from the beginning that are unrealistic, unachievable, and maybe even unnecessary, because we're starting with certain assumptions that actually nowadays we need to question. So the first question, the first assumption we need to question is really who is using English nowadays? What pronunciation are we talking about? So let's remind ourselves, and it wouldn't be an ELT event without a gap fill. So I'm going to give you a couple of sentences to fill. I've used this before in other workshops and other webinars, so you may have seen this already. If you know the answer, great, then well done, you have a slight advantage already over the rest of the attendees. If you don't know, make an educated guess. If you find that this data is already quite well known to you, then maybe you could also type in the chat box what you already know about the topic of this talk and what you're looking forward to from the webinar. So here are your 3 questions. When you type your answer in the chat box, please also type 1, 2, or 3 so we know which gap you are filling. Here you go. I'll give you about a minute. Okay, 5, 3, heaps. Uh-huh. 10, a lot. Uh-huh. Okay, so your guesses are quite high for all of these. Okay, 75%, 80%, 50%. Okay. Most. I like that as a nice general answer for number 2. Somebody asking, would the data have changed by now because it was published more than 10 years ago? That's a really good question. I'm going to come to that in just a moment, actually. So remind me if I don't answer that. Okay, let me reveal the answers. Are you ready? Drum roll, please. So you can see that your estimates were quite good. In fact, number one is actually quite a conservative estimate. And this number comes, as you can see, from 2008. So David Crystal published this number in a very short but very interesting and accessible article, which I recommend you check, where he explains some of the difficulties of counting the number of speakers. And this speaks slightly to the question one of you asked in the chat box a moment ago about whether these statistics change over time. Yes, they do change, and there are some more recent publications. It's quite rare to find linguists who are willing to be so brave as to put a number on these things. And these are the most reliable statistics that I can find. What the general agreement seems to be in the literature is that these numbers are increasing. So even if they've changed slightly, they're still changing in favor of the argument that I'm going to make in this webinar. And that's why I keep these, because I think they illustrate the situation quite clearly. And the situation that I want to illustrate, I suppose, is the reality of teaching English now. The point is that for most people who are learning English now, statistically speaking, they are probably not going to use their English with these native speakers, however we define that. And they probably don't need to sound like one. The people they're interacting with will not have the same expectations as someone who's learned English as a first language. If we think of some very common communicative scenarios, for example, in the world of travel, imagine you are a Japanese tourist, you're on holiday in Mexico, you check into your hotel. Neither one of you is using English as your first language. Or imagine you are a French engineer working in a team with other engineers from Turkey and from China, and you're having a meeting about an upcoming project. Or imagine you are a German student on a fashion design course at university, and you're attending a seminar. Your lecturer is Italian, the other students are Russian, American, Korean, Czech, Argentinian. In all of these scenarios, the language of communication is almost without a doubt English, even though there's only a very small minority of people in those scenarios who are using it as their first language. So they probably don't sound like first language users. They might not have the same expectations. They almost certainly don't have the same cultural expectations. But a lot of the assumptions we traditionally make are based on a native speaker listener, and that just simply isn't likely these days, even though, of course, it does still happen. And this use of English has a name. So we refer to it as English as a lingua franca, or ELF, or ELF for short, if you prefer. And so we can say that in most interactions, at least spoken interactions in English nowadays, English is not the first language of all of the speakers, or possibly any of the speakers, and they might not share the same first language. Which is to say that English is not being used as a foreign language. It's not being used as a language by a foreigner or an outsider to communicate with natives or insiders, but it's being used as the communicative medium of choice. So to bring us back to the topic of this webinar is, how does this relate to pronunciation teaching? Well, I've already started to talk about this a little bit, but there's one very famous phrase that was coined many, many decades ago, I think in the 40s originally. We often hear this phrase when we read and talk about pronunciation teaching. People refer to comfortable intelligibility. And generally speaking, this is interpreted as speaking in a way where your native speaker listener is comfortable listening to you. They don't have to make an effort to understand you. But there's an underlying assumption here that we can no longer make, which is, well, comfortable to whom? Who is this listener that we're imagining? We've always assumed that it's a native speaker. But nowadays, that assumption just doesn't stand. If we remember that the vast majority of the world's English users now are not using English as their first language, and they're not using it with people who use it as their first language, then we just simply cannot pretend that our students will only encounter British accents or American accents, for example. And we simply cannot assume that they would need such an accent themselves in order to be understood. If that were true, English wouldn't function globally today the way that it does in the worlds of business and academia and entertainment and sport and so on. And again, this is not new, but it's taking a lot of time for this to trickle down into our classrooms. And way back in the year 2000, so 18 years ago, David Crystal said, and I love this quotation as he's so good at summarizing the main point. He said then that we are already living in a world where most of the varieties we encounter are something other than traditional British or American English. And we do our students a disservice if they leave our care unprepared for the brave new linguistic world which awaits them. So, in practice, what does this mean? It means that we need to equip our students with appropriate linguistic resources and also with the discretion to use those resources in a flexible and dynamic and intelligent way so that they don't panic and fall apart when they leave the classroom and they realize that not everybody uses language in the same neat way that they've been in their course, for example. And it's true that it may be simpler and easier to consider only one or two varieties of English in our classrooms, but it's not realistic. So I think the ultimate question is, do we want to prepare learners for how we might prefer English to be, or for how English really is? Now, this means for us as practitioners, we have some new challenges and we have some new opportunities. So first and foremost, it is probably more useful to focus on intelligibility and not acceptability. So that means two things. There's different definitions of intelligibility, but these I think are the most workable for teachers. One is the extent to which a speaker's message is actually understood by a listener. And then the other is identifying the words and understanding the speaker's intended meaning. So again, this isn't new and we don't need to completely change everything we've always done. But what it means is that if we focus on understanding and on being understood in international contexts, then we're not so worried about sounding exactly like some idealized model or on attaining a particular accent, which actually very few people in the world have or need. We will also need to choose our materials and choose from our materials carefully, which, again, we do anyway. It just means that we might take a slightly different perspective when we're selecting, for example, a video to show our students. What range of voices are we going to include? In terms of what constitutes an error, again, this may just require a slight adjustment, a redefinition. We need to adjust our sensitivity to what is good or what is right, because there is no single widely agreed definition of either of these things. Now, in just a moment, we're going to look at which pronunciation features are most important for being understood in international settings. So again, I'll give you a quiz and I'll ask you to work out what you think are the most important features. And you'll see that all of those features do occur in native accents of English, but you'll also see that there are fewer things to cover when you're focusing on international intelligibility than when your goal is to achieve a particular native-like accent. This means that the time that we spend in class is more focused on being an effective communicator. And we save time because we're not worrying about other pronunciation features which don't support intelligibility. And I have never yet met a teacher who doesn't need more time. So this also seems like a good practical thing for me. So this is the big question. If we accept that the world is a different place than it was in the 1940s when the first definition of comfortable intelligibility was suggested, then we need to adjust our priorities slightly. And of course, the question arises, if we want to focus on being understood internationally, then what are those priorities? Now, fortunately, there's about 20 years of research on that. So we're going to look at this, and I'll mention at this point that intelligibility, of course, is a two-way street. So both the speaker and the listener matter when we're trying to achieve clear communication. Due to time, however, this is one webinar and a short 1 hour webinar, so we're not going to look at listening skills. We're only going to focus on productive skills, on a speaker's voice, on their pronunciation. So I'm going to show you a list of pronunciation features, and I want you to guess which of these features is shown to be important in research for intelligibility in international contexts. Remember those contexts I suggested earlier. So where there are numerous people interacting in English, but most of them don't speak it as a first language, if any of them. So I'll show you the list of features. I want you to type in the chat box which of these things you think are most important for understanding and being understood in that context. I'll give you 2 minutes. Here is your list. Okay, so please choose from these which you think are most important for intelligibility in a lingua franca context. Okay. Oh, this is very interesting. All of the, I'm afraid I can tell you now, it is not all of the above. Some of these items I will remove from the list in a moment. So this is your long list. I want you to make a short list. Interesting because we were all wrong. We'll see. It's not all of them. Why is there no intonation? I'm including that in tone. It's quite a big category. Something like strong weak forms might be more important for understanding. Oh, I'm trying to read your comment, but it keeps moving on my screen. Okay, I'll come back to it. So intrusion, catenation, assimilation, I'm including in connected speech features. Okay, it's been about 2 minutes. Are you ready? I'm going to reveal which of these features have been shown in research to be absolutely essential for intelligibility, for being understood in international contexts. You ready? One person's ready. Here we go. 2 people, 3 people. Okay, ready? Go. So, what is left in red is what research suggests is essential, which is to say that producing these features of pronunciation will help your intelligibility in an international context. And the other things, the things which I've crossed out, do not impact your ability to be understood in this context. Producing those features may give you a particular accent, they may create other impressions, but they're not relevant to being understood. And it's quite a complex picture, and I'm having to summarize for time. So I would really recommend that you read a little bit more detail on this. But just to summarize, of the vowel sounds, research suggests that actually only one of them is really important for intelligibility. This sound, as in bird or girl or word or third. And actually, what's more important about vowels is how their length changes depending on the sound that follows them. So, for example, in a pair of words like back and bag, the final sound, the k or the g, that will impact how long the vowel sounds. And I found this really surprising when I first read the research, because this is not in any ELT course I've ever used, and yet it was suggested that making this length distinction, a very, very small thing, actually made more of a difference to listeners' understanding, whether their vowel quality was more like a or e, for example. So what's really important is not that you produce an exact ah, like my ah or another speaker. It's that you have a representation in your mind of that vowel which is consistent and which is different from another vowel. But it's not about a specific quality. It's not about sounding exactly like me or exactly like another speaker. With consonant sound, this also really surprised me because they're not often covered in ELT courses in much detail. But actually, the consonant inventory of English is super important for being understood in an international context, except for these two favorite sounds, which so many teachers love and students struggle to produce. Actually, substituting them does not impact intelligibility, provided that you're consistent in your substitutions. So, for example, if you said f instead of th, it might create a particular impression in your listener, but it won't impact their understanding, provided that you're consistent, that you don't always change it. Schwa and weak forms were actually shown to be detrimental to intelligibility. So the more that you reduce your words with connected speech features or weak forms, the more that you squeeze things and make them harder to hear, the worse your intelligibility is. And funnily enough, there is decades of research showing that monolingual native speakers are usually the hardest to understand in international contexts. And it's often because of things like this. As for stress, this is a little bit of a gray area, and there's been a lot of research which has found different things. But one thing that appears to be quite important in most studies is called nuclear stress. And again, it has different names. Some people call it tonic stress. But essentially, we hear it most clearly when we use it for contrast or for correction. So if I say, for example, I'm going to France next weekend. So I've emphasized the word next. I've put the nucleus of my sentence on that word because I'm contrasting it with a different word like this weekend. So not this weekend, but next weekend. Now, all speech is divided into tone units in English, but this is the clearest example I can think of if you're not familiar with this concept of the tonic or nuclear stress. We put the stress on a particular point in a short unit to draw our listeners' attention to it. Now, as soon as you realize that if you move that to if you move the nucleus to a different syllable or a different word, of course, your listener's attention will be drawn to that word, and then that can impact intelligibility. So there's a lot of different factors at play here, and they all influence each other. But what's really important is also context. Listeners are quite smart. It's quite rare that things fall apart because one thing is wrong, let's say, for want of a better word. They use context. But of course, if multiple things deviate from their expectations in one short space, then that can make it difficult to understand. Overall, though, what you'll see is that this list of features is quite short. So the number of things that are really important for ELF intelligibility is actually quite focused. And none of these things are specific to ELF. They also exist in native accents. It's just that there are a lot of other things that native speakers do which do not help intelligibility and are not important for international understanding. In fact, they often get in the way. Last thing to mention is consonant clusters. I forgot to mention this when I said about consonant sounds. So of course, sometimes you have a word which has a sequence of consonants together with no vowels in between. Like in the word street. At the beginning of the word, there's st-r all together. And that is quite important to preserve as well, especially at the beginning of words. So that means that all of these other things, the things that are crossed out in gray, you can include them in your course. It's probably more useful to include them as listening practice, to understand when other people do them, and not to force your students to produce them when it's not necessary for them to be understood. And you've got so many millions of things to cover in your course. Really, you need to prioritize. So, as I say, those things that I've crossed out focus on receptive understanding, not so much on productive understanding. And I know this is a lot of information to take in, so what I'd like you to do is actually take a moment to relate this to your context where you teach. So try and take this set of features and think for a moment about a particular group of learners that you're familiar with. Think about people from a particular language background. Which of these things do you think would be important for them to focus on? And I'll give you an example of what I mean. So in a moment, I'll show you this. I'll say, what does this mean for speakers of English whose first language is blah, blah, blah? You choose Czech or Arabic or Russian, whatever. And I'll give you an example from Brazilian Portuguese. So if you were studying English in Brazil, you're focusing on being understood internationally, then you would probably need to focus on these things. So these consonants, and particularly the aspiration, because there's very little aspiration of these sounds in Portuguese, even though the same sounds exist, but they're not as aspirated as in English. They don't release the same amount of air when they say pin, for example, or tin. T and d are also a little bit different in that first language, so students might have trouble with them. They might sound a bit more like ch or j in some contexts. There may be some contrasts of sounds that you need to think about. So r and h, which is often influenced by spelling in Portuguese. You may also need to focus on m and n at the ends of words. And again, this is not because the sounds don't exist in Brazilian Portuguese, but because they behave in a different way at the end of a word. So they often get skipped from courses as teachers say, oh, that's fine, we have that sound in our language. That's true, but the sound doesn't behave in the same way, so you may need to look at it in a particular context. Again, clusters of consonants, maybe it depends on who you listen to and what research you read, so you need to listen to your students and observe what they're doing. And for vowels, just two things, just that one vowel sound and the length before voiced and unvoiced consonants. So that's like the example that I gave, like back and bag. So the second word has a slightly longer sound. There's a lot of things that you don't need to worry about, which are often included in courses in Brazil. So th and the, not a priority. This dark L used at the ends of words, like Brazil, not a priority. Schwa, not a priority. Word grouping, stress, maybe. There's different research here. Some students struggle with it more than others. So again, you'd need to listen to your students. The precise quality of your vowels, not important, just be consistent. Rising and falling intonation, again, not a priority for intelligibility. And syllable timing, the rhythm of Portuguese being carried over to the rhythm of English, again, not a priority. And this phrasing I'm using is really important, is not a priority. That doesn't mean that none of your students will care or none of your students will have trouble with these. It means that if you want them to be understood widely and internationally, don't prioritize these. If you have time and they want to do it, fine, but don't prioritize. So I'll give you a moment now to do this same exercise, but with a language that you're familiar with. So take another first language background and compare that to this set of features, which is called the lingua franca core. You can share your answers in the chat box if you like, or you can just reflect by yourself quietly. That's fine too. So take a moment to think, what would my students need to work on from this set of features, and what would they not need to prioritize? So take just 2 minutes. Spanish students, word grouping and nuclear stress, yes, absolutely, because in Spanish, of course, grammar is more commonly used for contrast than tone or movement of tone. Also for Italian, yes, absolutely. For Spanish, consonants, v and b, yes, definitely. Cluster, be careful with that. That's not what I'm referring to as a cluster. consonant cluster only refers to sound, not to spelling. What you've written there is a digraph and a trigraph. Yes, you're right that they would need to look at the relationship between spelling and sound. In Czech, I feel the stress within words is really the most challenging. Yes, absolutely, because of course stress in Czech tends to fall always on the first syllable. So that's really difficult for students to get used to. Again, within words, that's probably less of a problem than across sentences. But of course, to move the stress in a sentence, you also need to put it in the right place in the word. So I tend to feel that word stress would be important for Czech students, yes. Aspirated H for Italians. No, actually, that's an interesting one, and I forgot to mention. The h sound, while important, it doesn't matter if it's pronounced more like h, for example. That's not going to impact intelligibility because there's no h in most accents of English, so it's not confused with anything else. But pronouncing it, for example, in a word like hotel, instead of being silent, yes, that is really important. Sh and ng at the end in Spanish, yes. TH sounds, no. The TH sounds are not a priority for intelligibility. F, yes. The long and short I and E, that's important, but it's less important than their relationship with the consonants around them. So remember what I said about the quality of a vowel itself. That's not such a big problem. What's a problem is if it doesn't change in relation to the sound after it. I'm trying to think of a word like so, for example, hid and heed. I'll type it into the chat box. Hid and heed is less of an important contrast. Hid and hit is an important contrast. So for the first one, the I and the E, it's about raising students' awareness that many accents make that distinction, but that if they don't, it's not the biggest problem in the world. It's more important that the length is influenced by the following consonant. What's interesting is that a lot of languages have a distinction between long and short vowels. So Czech is a good example where I and I would be slightly different. Maybe that's the wrong vowel, but the length of vowels is distinctive in a way that it's not in English. And so for students who struggle to make the final consonant voiced, they might actually find it easier to make the vowel sound a bit longer. And the impact on the listener is the same. So that's a good way to help your students use something they're already familiar and comfortable with to help them with the thing that they're not familiar and not comfortable with. Marta, the example that you gave of sheet and the other word, when you say it comes up all the time, I don't know if you mean in your classroom because it's a funny example, so yes, we mentioned it, but I really feel that in most contexts of everyday communication in the world, the context would make it clear what the speaker was saying. And of course, one thing that we're not, that I haven't mentioned here is that many listeners, or rather many speakers in international contexts have similar contrast difficulties. And so for them, listening to someone having this contrast difficulty, it wouldn't be a problem anymore. Because often we're worrying about problems that would only be problems for native speaker listeners. And most of the people listening to our students are not native speakers, so their expectations will not be the same, and our assumptions should not be the same. An example of making a sound longer to make it easier to pronounce the final consonant. Okay, so in this minimal pair, word like hit and hid, in the second word, the final consonant is voiced, and that makes the vowel sound a little bit longer. Now, for some students, and actually for most languages, final consonants are not voiced. So some students find it really difficult to produce a d at the end of the second word, but they would find it easier to make the vowel sound a bit longer, especially if their language has a contrast like that. So like in Czech, these two words are different, and the accent on the A shows that it's a longer sound. So it may be easier for a student to lengthen their vowel slightly than to make the final sound voiced. Okay, I'm going to move on because I really want to look at some practical activities before we go. So this is a lot of information, I know, to throw at you, but I'm including links throughout the slides of where you can find more information, and there will be the recording as well of the webinar, remember. So what can we do in the classroom to help our students master these aspects of pronunciation? It's really important to remember that we do not need to reinvent the wheel. We don't need to change everything that we've ever done. We're just talking about a fresh perspective. Certainly not an overhaul of all of our existing practice. So we're talking about evolution of practice. We're focusing on intelligibility. So we're talking about adding skills, adding strategies to our students' repertoire, not reducing accent or features. We still need to do a needs analysis when we meet new students, so we still need to listen to them speak and think about what they might need to improve, but our benchmark is different. The thing which we're comparing them to is no longer a native accent, but a lingua franca core, that set of internationally intelligible features. We'll still need to focus on both productive and receptive skills. Of course, in this webinar, we're only looking at productive skills, but of course, in our classes, in our ELT courses, we need to look at both. That's always been the case. We'll still need to filter our materials and supplement them when we can't find what we need. Again, that's always been the case. And in class, repetition, drilling, and raising awareness have always been important, and they still are important, as are exercises which help us discriminate between similar sounds. And we're going to do one of those in a moment. That's all great for the whole class, but for individual needs, of course, there's still homework and there's still on-the-spot correction. So again, these are things that we've been doing for years when we teach pronunciation. We don't need to change all of this. It's simply that we will focus on different things maybe than we used to focus on. Now, if you teach in a multilingual setting, so for example, I used to teach in London, and in classrooms there were students from all over the world with loads of different first languages. Then you have a slight advantage because, of course, that is a lingua franca environment by definition. So what you can do is you can exploit that setting, exploit the ELF setting for peer interaction, as much as possible having the students work together and listen to each other, because that is exactly what they'll be doing in the real world. They'll be interacting with people from many different first language backgrounds. And you can then observe how intelligible they are to other people using English in that way. Now, there's an activity that I'll often do in this kind of context. It's quite long and long to explain. So what I've done here is just shown you a screen grab. There's a video on YouTube, and there's a link below that which has a full explanation of the activity. But it's basically a student-student dictation. The students have an opportunity to listen carefully to each other and write down what they hear. And then as the teacher, you collect that and you get a lot of real data on how well they were able to make themselves understood. And also then which things you need to work on in future classes. So the students benefit from exposure to different language backgrounds, and they also get immediate feedback on their communicative success. Now, of course, if you're in a shared first language setting or a monolingual group, so say, for example, you're teaching in Italy and all of your students' first language is Italian, then you also have advantages. You do need to find examples of other second language voices because they might not be available in the immediate environment, but you can exploit their common areas of difficulty and their common areas of ease as well. Of course, if you share their first language, then you also have a bilingual advantage. You have an insight into the process that's going on in their mind. And if you speak the same first language as them, then you're a fantastic role model of internationally effective English, as you're proving by being in environments like this where you interact with people from different backgrounds. So you're a much better role model of what the students can achieve than an imaginary anonymous native speaker in a book. There was actually a review a couple of years ago of the impact of the teacher's first language on the student's pronunciation instruction. And it was quite conclusive, and I really recommend you read it. It's a fantastic paper. And in the paper, they concluded, as I've written here on the slide, that being a non-native English-speaking teacher or a native English-speaking teacher is not a critical factor in teaching effective pronunciation teachers. So again, in most of the world's English language classrooms, the teacher shares the same first language as the students, and that actually can be a huge advantage. So there's a few different things you can do, some practical ideas. First of all, raising awareness. This is the first example I'll give you. We need to raise students' awareness of the use of English as a lingua franca. Even before we start working on their pronunciation, they need to know why we're doing it. Why is this important? You know, why do they need to say things in a certain way? So raising their awareness of their own voice and of others' voices and of real world communicative needs and context. They're so important. We basically need to create linguists in our classrooms, not just language learners. But this can be as simple as prompting them. You know, how would you say this word? Is that different? Is that similar to this speaker on a recording? How is it different? Why is it similar? What are some other ways we can say it? So you're just raising the students' awareness of the fact that not everybody speaks in the same way, and that's not good or bad, it's just real, it's just reality. We'll come back to part 2 of raising awareness in just a moment. But first we're going to play a game. I've been talking a little bit too much. Earlier I talked about the importance of distinguishing between similar sounds. So we're going to play a game that I call ping pong. It's a combination of ping pong and pronunciation. So what you do, it's very simple, is when something arises in class where, for example, someone mishears a word because it sounds very much like another word, or maybe in a multilingual classroom, one learner is trying to clarify something for a classmate, but not making any distinction between the sounds, and their other classmate, their peer, doesn't understand because they would expect a distinction. You've got 2 different words with two different meanings and only one sound different, so a minimal pair. And in this really simple activity, the students begin with receptive awareness and then they can play the game productively. So what you do is you put the 2 words on the whiteboard. Here's an example. And all the students have to do is point at which one they heard. Then after a moment, if you want to, they can do it themselves with their partner. So one of them says words, mixes them up at random, and their partner has to point at which one they heard. So we'll do it together. I'll say one or the other at random. You need to type which one you heard. Ready? Okay. Vet. Good. Okay, exactly. Wet. Great. Okay, you have the idea. It's much easier to demonstrate this in person than on a webinar, so well done. Thank you for trying that with me. And this works with any pair of words that have only one sound different. So sing and sink. Or here's an example of the vowel length difference, hat and had. Now, what's really interesting is that some recent research on pronunciation in interactions actually shows that in addition to the phonetic information, users of English as a lingua franca also make huge use of context and cotext to resolve any difficulties of comprehension. For example, they'll look at any visual aids which are in front of them, or their partner's body language might help, or other related verbal cues might help them understand. There's a summary of that research on the website that I set up with a colleague a few years ago to share things like this, and there's a link to it. And again, you'll have access to the slides after the webinar, so you can find more information about this. So of course, these small sound distinctions are really important to practice, but remember that listeners do also make use of context. One other game that we're going to practice, this again is about raising awareness, and this is a great example of where sound can influence reading and spelling. So developing our students' phonological awareness will help them in other areas. This is called a sound hunt. I would always do this after doing a reading activity with students, so they're not worrying about unknown vocabulary. They've already read the text. but now I want them to search the text for a specific sound. I'll give you a moment to read this text to simulate what I would do with my students in the classroom, okay? So first, just a moment to read the text. Okay, so just take a moment to read the text. Okay, I'll bring the text back in a moment, but as with my students, you've now read the text. Now imagine you've done some comprehension activities. You're not thinking about reading skills now. I'll give you the text and I'll also tell you a sound, and you need to find all the examples of that sound in this text. Now, depending on how confident my students are, I could give them help with this. I could tell them, for example, how many examples of the sound are in the text, and that would help make the activity a bit easier. So for the sake of time, I will also tell you, this is the sound I want you to look for. Is the sound, like at the end of a word like doing. There are 9 examples in the text. I'm going to show you the text again, and I'll give you a minute in the chat box to type all the examples that you can find in the text. Okay, here you go. Find 9 examples of in the text. Great. Okay, and I'll reveal the answers and you can check. Here you go. So you've got interesting, thing, lingua, franca, language, producing, think, doing, and something. And I said a moment ago that I would come back to the raising awareness. So this is another example of how we can raise students' awareness of how sound works and the relationship between sound and spelling. Because, and this is important because I've noticed some of the examples you're typing here reveal the things that students also sometimes miss or think about differently. So this spelling, the ng, is commonly pronounced as but typically not when followed by an E letter, as in range. So even though the spelling is similar, then the sound is different. Also, when you have an N followed by a K, that also often produces this sound. And what's really interesting, and where you have a huge advantage if you know your student's first language, is that this is actually true in many languages. So in the German word for the city, Frankfurt, in the Spanish word, banco, in Czech and in Slovak, the woman's name, Lenka, for example, a lot of the literature will tell you that these languages don't have the sound. Well, that's only partly true. It may not be a phoneme of the language, it may not change meaning, but it does occur almost accidentally in some similar contexts. Once students realize this, you can borrow that sound from their first language and put it into the second language, into English. And the last activity I'm going to show you is another example of this. So I call this borrowing, where you take a word from the student's first language, if that word contains the sound you're trying to practice. So here's the Spanish example. and then you help them take that sound and put it in their second language. There's 4 steps to this, and I'm going to show you a video. It's very short. It's a 20-second video, so you can see it in practice. These are the 4 steps. So you find an example of the target sound in the student's first language. You get them to pronounce that word in their first language, so you use that to help them make a bridge to the second language. And you isolate that sound, and now the second language can borrow it. And again, I'll show you an example. So let me just open the link. This should play automatically on screen, so make sure that your speakers are on. This is a real example that I filmed a couple of years ago in a classroom with a student of mine who's from Mexico. And we were borrowing the Z sound from his first language and using it in English, because this sound doesn't occur commonly in Spanish as a phoneme, but it occurs in some contexts. And so I filmed him. I asked him, do you mind if I make a video so I can show other teachers? So let me load the video. Make sure your sound is on. Can you see the video screen? I'm about to press play. Okay. So make sure your sound is on. Ready?
We go and I just write it. And desde. Z. Easy. Perfect.
Okay, so you can see how it works. And of course, it won't work with all sounds all the time. There are some sounds your students won't have in their first language, but there are some sounds that they will. And this is such a nice way of drawing their attention to what they can do instead of what they can't do, which is often how pronunciation teaching has been presented. So we'll finish the webinar with some Q&A, but first, some of you have asked for examples of some of the literature that I've been mentioning. So I'll give you some examples of further reading and resources as well that you can investigate more if you're interested in the topic. So there are a few books that I would recommend. This first book on the left was the original publication that started the field really growing. So even though things have moved on a little bit, it's a really good place to start if you want to understand the academic background for English as a lingua franca and pronunciation. The second book from the left, the kind of purpley one, is very practically focused, and it's where I've got some of my examples from, especially for languages that I don't speak fluently. The third book from the left, I've contributed a chapter to with a colleague of mine, Robin Walker, and we give case studies of teaching pronunciation from this perspective in a monolingual and in a multilingual context. And then the final one, the orange one, is an ebook that I co-authored earlier this year with Katie Simpson, and it's all about writing your own activities for practicing pronunciation. The video that I showed you and lots of other videos and resources and reading are all available on the blog that Katie and I also set up 5 years ago. So there's a link there, which again you'll have in the slides. And in the slides, and I won't read these to you because they're very long, but there's also references and reading available. So if you want to go and find more of the research, for example, you can look at the slides later and find out more.
Okay.
I think we have to stop there, unfortunately.
Yeah, we could go on all day, and I know that you'll be back very soon to offer the webinar again this afternoon. So, Laura, a big thank you from all of us on behalf of
Thank you
Macmillan.
for having me, and thank you to everyone who attended.